I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe, sound, healthy, and well-rested from what I hope for most of you was a well-deserved summer vacay. There used to be a time in Washington when August actually did anymore. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, set of virtual, at least for now, hopefully in person at some point, conversations on issues of critical import to the United States and to the world. Today, I'm truly pleased to welcome Ambassador Katherine Tai, the Biden administration's U.S. trade representative. And to be precise, I think the 19th since the position was created in 1962. I did a little research on this. It was once called, I thought, the special trade representative. Now it's just the trade representative. Ambassador Tai, let me take this opportunity to welcome you to Carnegie Connects and to what I know will be a great discussion of the Biden administration's policy on trade. Certainly your appearance here today is really quite timely, and we're really quite fortunate. You leave today for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Ministerial in Los Angeles, and I wish you luck on that. At the end, I'll wish you luck again. First, the backstory. As I often do with guests on this program, let me begin with your personal story. Who is Katherine Tai? And not from an existential point of view, but your career path has been nothing short of remarkable. Daughter of Chinese immigrants, born in Connecticut. There was Yale, there was Harvard. And you're one of the few, although you're in good company with Tony Blinken, Secretary Blinken, one of the few congressional staffers, I think, to ascend to a cabinet level position. There may be more, but the two of you, for sure, that's the case. So let me ask if you would share with us, what are some of the seminal experiences that shaped your own life, your view of government as an agency of change, and why trade policy as a career?
Great questions, Aaron, and I'm glad that you began with the caveat that these are not meant to be existential. So I'll try not to have them affect me existentially. To your question about why government, I actually grew up in the Washington, D.C. area because I'm the daughter of immigrants who came to the United States to study in the sciences, and who became federal government scientists. My father spent his career at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and my mother actually still works for the National Institutes of Health. I carried on the family tradition by working for the federal government, being in public service. Although I did buck tradition by not becoming a scientist myself. That maybe gets me to the question that you've posed about why trade policy in particular. And I think on this one, trade policy ended up being the confluence of many different things that I was interested in. I was a history major when I was in college. I love storytelling, in particular with history. It is a story of all of us. The history for every country and every culture is a large part about how we understand ourselves, where we have come from, and we need to know that in order to chart the path for where we are going to. I then, after college, spent 2 years teaching English in China. This was in the late 90s. I was at a university in the southern part of China, right across the border from Hong Kong. Was there the 2 years around Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule from British rule. And I think that my experiences there, teaching English, getting to know my Chinese students, seeing the economic activity around me in South China, being able to cross that border between China and Hong Kong at a very, very important moment in history really informed a set of interests that I had. And at the time, this is late 90s, it was when China was still very much in the hot and heavy stages of its negotiation to join the WTO. You could walk into any bookstore in the big cities in China, and there would be a big table of general interest books being written about the WTO and what it would mean for China to join it. And through all of this, it was very, very clear the incredible leadership role that the United States has in the global economy. So I came back from my 2 years teaching English in China. I went to law school, and through law school, started to think about how could I weave together my interests in history and what I had seen in China in terms of the interactions of the Chinese economy and the global economy, and I ended up doing international trade. I won't get into the specifics, but it took me to USTR earlier in my career as an attorney here. 7 years here, 7 years on the Hill, working for the Ways and Means Committee in the House. And then returning last year to USTR as the U.S. Trade Representative. And I think you are right. In many ways, this is a very American story and a bit of a Cinderella story, if you will, for trade policy people. I always thought that I would like to come back to USTR. Maybe had never really dared to think that I would come back as the U.S. Trade Rep.
It's fascinating, both in terms of the process, your Washington experience, and of course the substance. I dug out an interview you gave with NBC in May, and you described yourself then as a bridge builder, someone who's bridging two languages, two worlds, two cultures, and two sets of expectations. In such polarizing times, how does Katherine Tai build bridges on a pretty challenging issue? What do you mean you're a bridge builder?
I appreciate this question quite a bit because it has been a bit later in my life that I've looked back on my own childhood and upbringing and appreciated that growing up, I was every day moving between two worlds. There was my very close-knit family where we spoke different language at home, ate different foods, used different utensils at the dinner table, certainly, and then passed over into this mainstream American society where we were speaking English, in school, eating grilled cheese sandwiches at lunch with fork and knife, or mostly probably with my fingers. They're just looking back on it, pretty distinct worlds that I was moving between. I think what that has meant over time is that I have been someone who has been building bridges and traveling across bridges my entire life. And something else that I noticed in college was when I looked at my closest friends, that amongst the groups of my closest friends, well represented among those people were people who had either immigrated to the U.S. themselves as children or who were the children of first-generation immigrants. And they weren't necessarily, Chinese American, but what we had in common, I think, was an upbringing of bridging cultures, bridging languages. To your point about polarization, the politics of trade, I'll just observe this, which is I think you're absolutely right to make this connection. We have the need to bridge gaps within our own society, in our political landscape. On trade, I'll give you an example. I think that, the gaps may not be as large as sometimes we think. Democrats and Republicans often have very similar, if not the same, concerns. And I only know trade policy really well, so I'll stick to my area of trade policy. And this could also be true in other areas too. But there often is a tension between how international trade rules interact with our own domestic policies and regulations. International trade rules attempt to discipline what countries can do, and there's a natural friction point with domestic policy making. For Democrats, we talk about this often as the need to preserve and retain policy space when we are negotiating trade rules, to ensure that trade rules are not unduly taking away the jurisdiction for domestic policymakers, especially in a democracy. For Republicans, you will often hear concerns around sovereignty and how sovereignty interacts with international trade rules. And if you unpack those sovereignty concerns, they end up being very, very similar, again, if not the same concerns that Democrats will talk about as the need for public policy space. And I think that the ability to translate some of these languages and concepts between groups is absolutely critical to what we do, certainly in trade policy, but probably beyond that as well.
We're going to get back to this issue, excuse me, of domestic politics and China a little later in the conversation. But before we move on to the substance, I wanted to ask you one more issue. You co-chair the White House initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. These are very fraught times, certainly for Asian Americans. I was just wondering, how does your own identity, that bridge building, affect your views of the Asian American community and the role that they could possibly play in that bridge building with some of the very important countries that you cover on the trade issue?
That's a great question. I think it goes beyond just the Asian American community, and in all of our trade conversations, being the country that we are, I think that it is a tremendous resource that we have in terms of diaspora communities, American communities that have roots and strong relationships with other parts of the world. In terms of what Asian Americans, and when I talk about Asian Americans, when we talk about the White House initiative, it's on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And I think that really drives home the point that within the Asian American community, this is a community of communities. There is a tremendous diversity and nuances within this community. But even so, I think that one of the things that the people in these communities share has been a longstanding struggle around belonging and fighting for the sense of belonging here in the United States, that we have been a part of American culture, American society, the fabric of America for a very long time. And yet for a very long time, legally, but also socially and culturally, there is a sense that we continue to stand on the outsides and are considered still more other than other groups within the United States. And on that, I just wanted to, I guess, make the point about my own consciousness in taking on this role. I serve as the United States Trade Representative as an Asian American. As an Asian American, it is my job to represent the interests of the entire United States, all of our communities, all of the segments of our economy, our businesses, our industry, large and small, our workers, our civil society interests, our Democrats and our Republicans on the world stage. And I think that for me, that is a special sense of responsibility and a special privilege that I bring to serving in this role.
I wonder if there is a way to organize diaspora communities, maybe even some sort of formal role at the Department of Commerce or the SBA that would tap the talents, the empathetic capacities, and the backgrounds of all of these groups in the service, of course, of the interests of the Republic.
I think that we are all thinking about where we can be doing more outreach, where we can be creating more institutional structures. I talked to the administrator of the Small Business Administration, Isabel Guzman, and obviously also Gina Raimondo at the Commerce Department. Talked to both of them on a quite regular basis. And I know that we are all thinking about these structures for outreach and expanding the participation in our policy areas. Here at USTR, I have tasked our team, and we've done a lot of work actually to reach out to diaspora communities and to do briefings before I travel out to the region, before we engage in these big events. And it is obviously an area where there is more work to do, but you're absolutely right and onto something that I think is really important in terms of connecting our policies, in particular our trade policies, to the interests of our communities and our people.
Yeah. Before we move on, I need to. You don't have to answer the question, but we talked a bit about it off camera. Michael Hirsch, writing in Foreign Policy in February, this was before you were confirmed, basically said that it was hard, quote, no, impossible, unquote, to find anyone in Washington who doesn't like Katherine Tai. Now, that was before you were confirmed. 18 months later, I mean, it's a rare thing in this city. I've been here for 40 years. It's a rare thing in this city to have somebody say that about you. I want to ask for the answer 18 months later, whether or not that's still the same question. But let's unless you want to comment, we can move on to trade.
Aaron, the only thing I was going to say is I think probably the same is said about you. I haven't met, and I certainly don't know of anybody who doesn't like you. And so I think that
I would say I truly appreciate that comment. It's way too kind. At some point, maybe we'll have a cup of coffee. I'll show you my Twitter feed. That is definitely not the case. Okay, so let me begin the discussion this way. Writing in the 19th century, Marx, Karl Marx, not the other one, wrote, and he was writing in the 19th century, men make history, Marx wrote in the 19th century, but rarely as they please. So for any trade negotiator looking out at this environment, I mean, you're going to forget more about trade than I'm ever going to know, but it seems clear to me this is an incredibly fraught environment. You've got the implications of residual COVID. You've got Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You've got supply challenges, energy spikes, food insecurity, debt crises in developing countries. And you have international institutions, G7, G20, and of course, you're the one you're most familiar with, WTO, that don't seem equipped basically to deal with these challenges. And if that wasn't enough, you've got some serious challenges here at home, both to the nature of our democratic system, but on the issue of trade, I just pose this question to you. You've got a lot of countries organizing mega regional deals on trade. Mm-hmm. You've got the regional comprehensive economic, what's it called?
Partnership, I think.
Partnership. You've got the comprehensive progressive trans-Pacific partnership. You've got a couple of these economic partnership agreements, EPAs. And now you have IPEF, which we're going to talk about later. But if liberalizing trade through our traditional instruments of FTAs, free trade agreements, is really not the basic focus of the Biden administration's policy, how do you set your priorities? How do we not get excluded, particularly in Asia, from these mega regional alignments and compete?
Sure. So I think that if you focus on what everyone else is doing, you often lose the thread of yourself, and I think that's probably true in our personal lives and real life as well as in trade policy. I think that I want to go back to the first part of what you presented in teeing up this question, which is the degree to which the global economy and the global economic order has run into challenges in these most recent years. And I might even go back to, obviously this year we've got Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For the past now 2.5 years, almost 3 years, we've had the COVID pandemic and associated disruptions and discombobulation. I think you could also go back to 2016 and look at President Trump's messages on trade and also the Brexit referendum as well. Obviously, the UK's participation in the EU is about more than trade, but trade is a big part of it, and certainly has been a big part of the conversation ever since between the UK and the EU. I don't have anything really smart to say about all of these disruptions and how they relate to each other than to reinforce your point, which is it does feel like the global economy right now is fraught in a way that we didn't feel it was 5-7 years ago. And so what does that mean for us? I think that first and foremost is coming up with a reasonable diagnosis for what is happening and why we are where we are. A once in a century viral pandemic seems like the kind of thing that happens, but is hard to predict when it's going to happen. But I would say this: the trade liberalization program that many of our institutions are based on has been very successful in many, many ways. It has brought about this version of globalization that is reflected in the world economy today. I think that it is not controversial to say that it has grown the pie. We have increased global economic prosperity. But where we are today, I think we are seeing some of the limits of this particular program. Over the course of the growing of the pie, I think that inequality feels like it is on the rise today. And it's not just here in the United States, but there are a lot of conversations I have with counterparts where there is a similar sensitivity that economic policymakers in other countries are grappling with around the rise of inequality. So growing the pie doesn't necessarily mean that there is more pie to be had by everyone. There are concentrations of where the pie is. And this goes to President Biden's point, his vision about growing the economy. And he does this thing with his hands that I really love, growing the economy from the bottom up and the middle out, to really reinforce that prosperity and the growth of prosperity is works more like a tree, that it's something that you have to grow. Your question is, if liberalization isn't the main point, how do we not get left out? And I think that this is the thing. Liberalization has also taken us to a point where essentially firms have been given the incentive to chase and maximize efficiency. So that means minimizing your costs, maximizing your revenues. I think that one lesson that we are learning through all of these disruptions is that efficiency alone has created this quite fragile global economy that we are contending with right now. And so the idea is not to abandon efficiency, but to make sure that efficiency isn't the only incentive that's motivating economic activity through the rules that we're creating with our trade policies, that we're also incentivizing resilience. And a lot of that means incentivizing firms and economic participants to factor in risk as they're making their decisions. So, what I would say is, if we're working towards a version of globalization that's going to be more resilient and it's going to be more resilient to future shocks, I'll add in the climate crisis is another aspect of what it feels very intensive and urgent right now in terms of our global economic needs. that it is about figuring out with our partners, because we can't do it alone, with our partners and our allies, how to pursue a set of goals that will result in a more resilient version of globalization. And the reason why I don't feel left out is because I don't think that anyone's cracked that nut yet. And we, as the United States, need to be at the cutting edge of figuring out how do we deploy these more traditional tools that we have, including trade liberalization, but to harness them to serve a larger purpose around resilience, but also sustainability with respect to our planet, and also the treatment of our people and our workers in the global economy, and overall in terms of growing the economy and prosperity from the bottom up and the middle out. How do we work towards a prosperity that is more inclusive?
Right. We seem to be saying that globalization 1.0 is over, and now you have globalization 2.0, and you're trying to structure a set of arrangements that avoid a sort of race to the bottom. There are a lot of players in that equation, right? You got the companies here, whether or not they're prepared to buy off on that. You've got our allies and our adversaries, Asia in particular. I want to concentrate on China. And then you have the domestic environment. So you're tutoring me, Ambassador Tai, as well. Let me lay out a proposition. The Biden administration is kind of in a bind. On one hand, it's politically fraught to push to open American markets abroad. I mean, after all, Biden ran on a platform of protecting American workers and jobs, limiting foreign competition. But on the other hand, our trading partners, or some of them, want preferential access to U.S. markets, something that, in domestic politics is a part of any foreign policy. So I'm not here to beat you up. I've had my own experiences with that. You've got to find a balance, right? I mean, I remember thinking to myself, I'm sure glad Congress isn't making American foreign policy. But having worked for the State Department for 25 years, I don't want the Department of State making American foreign policy either. It's a question of figuring out what the national interest of the United States is, and that's a presidential issue. But if you're caught in a bind that our trading partners want access, but the politics make access to our markets hard, how do you compete? And I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we'll get to in a minute, is the Biden administration's answer to that problem. But just as a general proposition, is that an accurate? Have I flunked the test here, or is that do we get a C in analyzing the nature of the domestic problem?
Aaron, I think that you've identified all of the forces that I know are at play in the area where I work. But I think I might reframe it a little bit insofar as I don't see it as a bind. I think that this is just always the case. A couple things about trade policy that I've appreciated over time is that we exist at a very uncomfortable kind of a tension point between a number of different powerful forces. So you've identified two of them. Trade policy sits at the intersection of foreign policy and national security policy, but also domestic economic policy. This goes back to our origins. Before we were created, we were a subset and a function of the State Department, and we were specifically carved out of the State Department because Congress wanted to make sure that the deals that we were striking for foreign policy reasons that have significant domestic economic impacts were going to be informed by a more of an economic deal-making perspective. And so it was about taking us out of the State Department, putting us inside of the Executive Office of the President, and then, this is the other uncomfortable but important intersection where we sit, making us responsive also to the Congress. So the other intersection is between the executive branch and the congressional branch. Powerful forces. It is always about finding that balance fighting against one or the other to make sure that you don't stray too far in one direction or the other. So, to your question about domestic economic forces versus what our trading partners want, that part I want to revisit a little bit, because I think that there are a number of things that we have done to prove this particular point, which is I don't think it's a zero sum kind of a bind. I think that a lot of what we are doing in this administration is bringing conversations and building on our relationships with our closest allies and our partners to work together on this globalization 2.0 vision. I wouldn't say 1.0 is over. I would just say that we need to evolve globalization to be more resilient and responsive to the challenges that we are experiencing today. And it is something where we need the partnership of others, but will also serve the interests of our partners too. And I think that that's the point, which is to take ourselves out of opposition with our trading partners. As an example, with the European Union, we spent most of last year negotiating down the steel and aluminum tariffs that we imposed on them in 2018 and the retaliatory tariffs that they hit back with. What we have right now is, I think, one of the accomplishments that I am most proud of, which is we have dialed down the tensions between us. And we are working together, US, EU, on what we're calling the global steel arrangement. The vision for this global steel arrangement is a way for the US and the EU markets to join forces to incentivize fair trade into our markets and between us in steel and aluminum, and also clean trade in these industries. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is an example of how we bring together the forces that, frankly, we are all facing, domestic versus international, but then also, right, between the trade policies that we have had and the global economic order that we're working towards.
Harder to do that, I suspect. I mean, working with fellow democracies, I would argue, is probably an advantage, right? When it comes to some of our Asian partners reforming their systems on issues like digital trade, supply chains, climate, corruption, probably going to be a lot harder. But I want to get to the semi-main event here. Well, China is on everyone's mind. And I had Kurt Campbell on the show in January, and Kurt actually foreshadowed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework by saying that somebody asked him, what about competing in Asia? And he said, that's, quote, that's an area where the U.S. indeed needs to step up its game, Campbell said, adding that the U.S. role must go beyond traditional trade and include digital engagement and technological standard setting, which is to some degree reflected in the IPF. But you're negotiating with China. You speak Mandarin. You've had experience in China. Sitting across from your counterpart, is this a real negotiation? In other words, is it possible to have a discussion with China in which you would say, here's what we need, listen to what they need, assuming that both sides, I've never been in a negotiation in which that led to a deal in which both sides interests weren't somehow reflected. Is it possible to have such a negotiation with China? And I guess it raises the question, Ambassador Tai, what exactly do we want out of China on trade policy? I mean, I guess that's my central question. What are our national interests vis-a-vis China in trade? And how do we get there?
Well, you've given me a lot in your segue, and I hope that we'll have a chance to return to the Indo-Pacific, which I think we probably will. But let me take on your China question first. In terms of first question I heard you ask is it possible to have a real negotiation with China where we can sit down and talk about these are my interests, these are your interests, what do we do about it? Absolutely, yes, I think it is possible. I think we have had those types of conversations in the past, and we will have them. in terms of what is it that we think each of us wants, I think, and what is it that we want from China, I think is the specific question that you've asked.
Yeah.
I think there is a useful there's a useful analogy that a good friend of mine, former USTR, Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs, has used, and I think it's not perfect, but it's really illustrative of a dynamic in the U.S.-China trade relationship. Tim Stratford, I have to give him credit for this, described our economic and trade relationship between the U.S. and China as two teams on a field, both who have shown up to play football, except that one team has shown up and they are playing American football. The other team has shown up and they're playing what the rest of the world calls football and what we call soccer. And I think that there is an elegance to that particular analogy in terms of what it captures in the tensions between the U.S. And China in trading with each other and also trading within the global trading system, which is that we're structured differently along different philosophies and principles. We've evolved out of different histories. And there are ways in which we're not are competing against each other doesn't feel fair. In some ways, I think what we really want from China in terms of economics and trade is for the Chinese economy to operate like ours. And along the assumptions and the norms that we feel are embodied in organizations like the World Trade Organization and the General Agreement for Tariffs and Trade that came before it, which is open, market-based, with a pretty clean separation between government and state and the market and the economy. We don't have that. And I think that the Chinese have pursued a model that is different from ours. And so, it has been for a long time our perspective, well, we just keep putting pressure on China, some combination of carrots and sticks, some combination of dialogue and enforcement. And, we can bring China along in China's evolution and its reform of its own economy. And I think in the last 10 years, we've had much an awakening to the fact that, China is pursuing its own policies and its own perspective. And so I think what this means is we talk about turning the page on the old playbook and approaching the China challenge differently, which is until the day that China chooses a path to have its economy operate more like ours. I think we see that we need to have more effective tools in ensuring that we can continue to compete and we can continue to allow our economy to thrive along the principles that our economy is built on. And so that is a combination of the tariffs that are in place, but also I want to, draw your attention, certainly, and your audience's attention to other policy accomplishments that the United States has made over the last year and a half, 2 years, in terms of making investments in the United States and American competitiveness. And there is this combination of defense and offense that we have to deploy in order to continue to be able to compete.
Yeah. Given the environment in Washington on China, which frankly is bipartisan, I mean, Mr. Putin may have achieved something that most American politicians have not, which is to create a modicum of bipartisanship on Ukraine. President Xi may, frankly, have achieved the same thing. But you've described the relationship with China as, quote, unduly difficult, unquote. It seems to me what you're saying is that if you can't affect China directly, then you have to affect your allies in the region in order to change the environment in which China operates, which raises the whole question of competition. And your critics would say lack of market access when it comes to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But I want to turn to that now because you're headed off to Los Angeles This is fascinating for me, by the way. I mean, again, you're going to forget more about trade I'm ever going to know, but I'm learning a ton, and we could go on for another hour. I got all kinds of questions, but let me just ask you on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. You've characterized the initiative, which was announced, I think, in May, as America's counterpart to the, if I have this wrong, please tell me, America's counterpart to the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific, whatever it is, CPTPP. CPTPP. As noted, it's not a traditional trade accord. It's impressive that 13 countries have signed up. It's impressive that you've made progress on digital trade, supply chains, with more progress to come, without offering market access or lower tariffs. So how do you see the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as you head out to Los Angeles, I think, today?
Certainly. I think that there is a tremendous opportunity here. And the fact that 13 countries have signed up for this, I think shows that our partners want us in the region. They're excited for this engagement. They're excited for the substance of the engagement. I agree with Kurt that the innovation of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is that it goes beyond a traditional trade agreement. Trade is one component in a larger program. It's one of 4 pillars, we're calling them. The other ones address supply chains, decarbonization and infrastructure, tax and anti-corruption, 4 pillars. So first, trade is an important part of this, but not the only part of the engagement that we're bringing. The second part of it is, even within trade, we've got in this pillar 7 components. They are 7 components that we think are really critical to addressing the specific challenges that you've already identified earlier in our conversation around the disruptions in the global economy and our search for, in cooperation and partnership with our close trading partners, our search for a new paradigm. And, the pieces in here headlined by labor and environment rules, but also around what we call trade facilitation, which are really, I think, enhanced and updated customs, administration disciplines and capabilities, science and evidence-based approach to agriculture. You would see it on our website. They're listed. There are 7 components. But what we're really trying to do is, in partnership with these other countries, to establish rules, to create work streams that will allow us together to promote the themes of sustainability, resilience, and inclusive prosperity for our economies and for this region. We are an Indo-Pacific power, always have been. It is about bringing along this set of partners with us in the work, and the important work in evolving a globalization that has been based on market access and competition to one that we are hoping doesn't just prevent the race to the bottom, but actually will promote the race to the top. And we very much believe that the 7 components of the trade pillar are rewarding in and of themselves as we accomplish rules and standard setting in this grouping with our partners.
And in terms of concrete, diplomacy is developmental. I know that from 25 frustrating years. Could you share with us a goal or 2 that might emerge from the ministerial?
From the ministerial?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. So this will be the first time that we have all assembled as ministers. I had an informal convening back in June with trade ministers as we were all on our way into Geneva for the WTO ministerial conference. But this is going to kick off the hard work that, frankly, our senior officials have already been doing. But I would say this is a bit like the I don't know what a good analogy is. Maybe at the beginning of a race when you bring that flag down. But to your point about relationships, bringing everyone together in person, especially coming out of these COVID affected years, is for us really, really important point of laying the foundation for the work and the accomplishments that are going to come.
I was going to conclude with a question on the WTO, but I think I'll spare you and our audience that question. I have a lot more homework to do on that issue anyway. I have to say, Katherine Tai, that Michael Hirsch was right. I find you incredibly engaging, and as I learn more, I may have questions that are more critical. But I have to say, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has as well. I wish you the best of luck on the eve of this ministerial, and perhaps early next year, there'll be other advances in trade. You'll come back and talk to us again.
Well, I have really enjoyed this, Aaron, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So count me in.
Terrific. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.